Okay, so what have we learned so far? We've learned how to write a model object, and we've learned how to annotate various fields in the model object so that Hibernate creates a table for us, and then we do the mapping. We've learned how to save this object into the database. We've learned how to retrieve data from the database and create model objects with the data populated. And we've learned to do all that using Hibernate APIs. This is all fine, but we are making one assumption here. We are assuming that the member variables inside this model object can all go inside single columns. We made the assumption that an ID can be just one column. The name member variable can be one column, so and so on. So the example that we've taken allows this. It's possible to have single columns for each member variable because of the data type that it's using. See, they're primitives. ID is an integer, name is a string, address is a string, phone number is a string, date of birth is a single date. So each one of them can be represented as individual columns, which is fine. Now the question is, what if one of these member variables were to be an object instead of just a simple data type which can fit into a column? Say one of these were an object, and that object had a few member variables inside of them, each of them having particular values. Now how would you save that using Hibernate? And what if one of them was an array? What if one of them was a list or a set? How would we save that using Hibernate? So that's what we're going to learn in this tutorial. And not just this tutorial, we're going to have a few more tutorials in which we'll explore this option, because there are a few permutations and combinations when it comes to having objects inside objects, or any of these collection objects inside our model object. So the first scenario that we're going to take is this. We will have a user class, and the user class, instead of having an address string, it'll have an address object. We'll write a separate address class, and the address class will have street, city, state, and pin code. And now our user class, instead of having a simple string as an address member variable, it'll have an instance of this address object. Now the question is, how do we save this address object in the user table? It's not a string anymore, so we cannot have it inside one column. We have 4 member variables of this address object. Now how are we going to save all those 4? We'll look at the most simplest implementation for this scenario in this tutorial, and we'll look at a little bit more advanced implementations later on. But as of now, the simplest way to do this is to have each of these member variables of the object inside the user class also to have separate columns. So what I mean to say is, now the user class has an address object, and the address object has some member variables. We're going to treat the member variables of this address object the same way as you would treat member variables of the user class itself. So we'll assume that there is no address object, it's just street, city, state, pin code are 4 other member variables of the user class itself, and we would save it the way we would save 4 member variables. So what we are essentially saying is to have separate columns and have street as a column, city as a column, state as a column, and a pin as a column. So we're assuming that it's almost as if these member variables are member variables of the user class, and so it's not like there's another object and the member variables are of that object. It's almost as if it's just one class and all these are flat member variables. That's how we're going to represent this. This option works fine on a particular scenario, and that scenario is if the object inside this user class is a value object. Now what do I mean by value object? When dealing with Hibernate, we see 2 kinds of objects. One is the entity and one is the value object. Now an entity is something that we saw earlier, that was the user class. User is an entity. It has an object, needs to be saved as a separate table in the database, and it actually, it's an entity in the sense of the word that it is independent and it contains data that provides meaning about itself. Now what is a value object? Then a value object is an object that has data, and even that has to be saved to the database, but it does not have meaning on as of itself. It provides meaning to some other object. Let's take address for example. Address, yes, you can have an address object with the street, city, state, and pin code values all populated. But the address object as of itself does not carry any meaning. When you say address, then you say whose address? It's an address of a user class. Just like a name here is name of this user, phone is phone number of this user. The same way the address is the address of this user. Now without having a user object, just an address doesn't make sense. Just a phone doesn't make sense. It doesn't have a purpose. So its purpose in life is to provide value to this user object. So that is what differentiates an entity from a value object. An entity has meaning on its own, but a value object does not have meaning on its own. So it's not just this address object here, even name, it's a string, so it's a value object. It has a value for an entity and it does not have meaning on its own. So that way, address object here is a value object. So when you are dealing with value objects, you have a different approach versus when you're dealing with entities itself. Well, you can have an entity inside another entity. So there's no stopping you from having, say, another object here, which is actually an entity, but it is related to the user object. So you can have a member variable, which is another entity. And that entity might have a meaning of its own, but it happens to be inside another entity. But that's not the case when it comes to the address. Address does not have meaning on its own. It has to be inside a user object, has to be associated with the user object, otherwise there's really no point in having an address object. So that's what makes the address object as a value object. So this approach that we're going to look at in this tutorial can be applied to value objects. So we're going to look at some examples of how we can have an entity inside another entity later, but for now, if you understand what a value object is and how it can be associated to an entity, that should suffice. So this is a value object, and this is the approach that we're going to take. We're going to have the columns separately for this value object, so which works fine because there's no point in having an address as a separate table. Again, as we discussed, it doesn't have meaning on its own. It has to be associated with the entity, so why not have it in the same table? Okay, now let's look at how we implement this in Hibernate. So I'll create a new address class. And this address class will have string street okay, city, state, and I'll leave this as a string for the pin code. Okay, and I will generate getters and setters. For all of them. Now, in order to mark this as a value type, and in order to tell Hibernate not to create a separate table for this, I need to use the annotation at embedded. At embedded tells Hibernate that this object needs to be embedded inside something else. Now, what I'll do is I'll go to the user details class. I don't have much here. I just have the user ID and the username. I'll create a new member variable here for address, and I'll also generate the getters and setters for this. Okay, so now this should do. Now Hibernate will know that this address is not a separate entity by looking at this guy here. It says address is embeddable, so it has to be embedded. So it automatically does the embed. You can also actually have another annotation here, which is embedded. Now this embedded again is another clue for Hibernate to say that this is, it's an embedded object. You don't have to do this. This is not mandatory. If you have this class and the class has been marked as embeddable, that should do. It'll tell Hibernate that it has to embed it. It has to put it in the same table, and the table we already defined. So let's run this. I will have to create a value for the address also. Now we have initialized the two users. I'll say address addr equals new address addr.set street. Okay, I'll have to import address from the DTO. Set street name addr.set city name. Yeah, that should do for now. I'm not going to fill out all the values. Now I'll say user.set address addr and user2 dot set address. I'm gonna set, okay, let me remove this. I'll just set for user the first object alone. I'm not gonna set for the second object. So now I'm persisting this. Why don't I remove this? I don't need this second user. Just to simplify things a bit, I'll just have one user and one address. Simple enough. And I will save that user and I'll close. Now let's see what happens if we run this. Yeah, save this. Okay, it's inserted, and look at the query that's just generated. It's generated city, pin code, state, street, everything are columns of the user details table alone. So if we run the query, we'll know what the database looks like. Well, there you go. You have the city name, you have the pin code, state, street. All these are actually member variables of the address object, but they end up in the user table itself because we have set the address as embedded and we have the address class here as an embeddable class.